Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program tonight. Before we begin, a reminder that this program will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube. Please direct any questions that you may have via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and our speakers will be able to answer them later on in the program. The Jewish Heritage Centre of Western Canada is located on ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory, and the Red River Valley is also the birthplace of the Métis. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. May we live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with its peoples. The mandate of the Jewish Heritage Centre is to develop, interpret, and disseminate information on the history and culture of Western Canadian Jewry, and to develop awareness of the history and the moral and ethical implications of the Holocaust and other human rights violations. As one of our generous supporters so aptly put it, in order to look to the future, you have to preserve the past. Tonight marks the Jewish Heritage Centre's second event for Holocaust Education Week, the first time that Winnipeg joins communities across Canada for this important week of programming that unpacks the complexities of the Holocaust and encourages best practices. We thank the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg for its partnership and ongoing support, as well as the Azrieli Foundation, the Jewish Foundation of Manitoba, and the Asper Foundation, all of whom help to ensure that Holocaust education reaches thousands of students and adults each year with our programming. And now to introduce tonight's program. The riot that took place in Christie Pitts Park on August 16th, 1933 is a dark stain on Canada's past. It remains one of the worst outbreaks of ethnic violence in Canadian history, with over 10,000 participants and spectators. The riot was sparked by Nazi-inspired youth flying a swastika flag at a public baseball game with the intent to antagonize and provoke Jewish Canadians. Unfortunately, education on anti-Semitism in Canada is seldom taught in our schools. Jamie Michaels has produced a wonderful graphic novel that depicts the Christie Pits Riot in a new way, and we're thrilled to have Jamie with us tonight in conversation with Dr. Karlee Sapoznik-Evans to present the novel. But before I introduce them, we'd like to show you a brief documentary.
The summer of 1933 is one of hot weather and high tensions. No place feels it more than Christie Pitts, a baseball diamond in Midtown Toronto, next to Jewish and Italian immigrant neighborhoods. The surrounding neighbors make no secret of the fact that immigrants are not welcome.
This isn't your country! Go home, Jew! Hey! What do you think he's trying to do?
And the message is clear.
We want to get the Jews out of the park!
Those hate-filled voices against Jews were part of a deeply troubling movement unfolding in many parts of the world. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rose to power in 1933. A vicious campaign against Jews and other minority groups soon followed. But the dangerous attraction of the swastika was growing on both sides of the Atlantic. During the Great Depression, some Canadians looked for scapegoats to blame for their hardships. In fact, anti-Semitism was nothing new in Canada. In the first half of the 20th century, Jews were relegated to second-class citizens. The few allowed into Canada as immigrants faced systemic discrimination. Businesses refused to hire them, universities restricted their enrollment, and entire neighborhoods prohibited the sale or rental of housing to Jews. Across Canada, local political leaders were vocal about their prejudice. They spread violent propaganda against Jewish people, turning decades of intolerance into hate. In Toronto, young Anglo-Canadians formed swastika clubs and embraced the Nazi symbol. One that was impossible to separate from the atrocities perpetrated against the Jews of Europe. In protest against Hitlerism, Jews took to the streets. They were joined by laborers, union representatives, and left-wing political groups. Motivated by different causes, they stood united against fascism. Thousands protested, but swastika clubs continued to incite hostility against Toronto's Jews. No laws prevented this, and so clashes regularly broke out between the two groups. That was the backdrop to August 16th, 1933, as Christy Pitts seemed ready to explode. At the Ball Diamond, fights erupt in the stands. Supporters of the predominantly Jewish Harvard playground baseball team, members of the Swastika Club, and other Anglo-Canadians trade punches. Police have difficulty breaking up the fights. As the game ends, a homemade swastika flag is unfurled on the slope next to the Ball Diamond.
The swastika! The swastika!
It's the spark that ignites all tensions.
The swastika came at the end of the ball game. All hell broke loose. When this race riot broke out, it really broke out. All I saw was people getting hit. The bats all disappeared. We had 15 bats and they were all gone.
The riot quickly spills out of the ballpark.
Truckloads from Spadina Avenue came up. Now there were some tough guys down there.
Reinforcements arrived to support both sides. Italians and other immigrants persecuted by the Anglo majority fight alongside the Jews. Violence explodes across the night. For 6 long hours, thousands of people fill the streets of Toronto, with Jews, Italians, and others taking a stand against racist ideas of what it means to be Canadian. After the unprecedented violence, Mayor William James Stewart promises to prosecute future displays of the swastika. It's a small victory, paid for with black eyes and broken bones, but it's one of Canada's first anti-hate policies. Other lessons from the riot take longer to learn. Of the Western countries that took in refugees during the Second World War, Canada accepted the smallest number of Jews fleeing Nazism. The Christie Pits Riot remains one of the worst outbreaks of ethnic violence in Canadian history. The Jews and Italians who took to the streets that hot summer night in 1933 fought for the Canada we live in today. One that recognizes multiculturalism as a strength. That struggle continues to be our responsibility, as hate crimes against Jews are still widespread across Canada.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karlee Sapoznik-Evans, who in turn will introduce Jamie Michaels. Dr. Karlee Sapoznik-Evans is a long-standing social justice and human rights advocate and researcher. She was named one of CBC Manitoba's Future 40 Under 40 and has served as part of reconciliation, anti-slavery, genocide prevention, social justice, and human rights initiatives across Canada, in Sierra Leone, Mali, Peru, Italy, England, Spain, Poland, Ukraine, Israel, and the United States. From 2014 to 2015, she led a team of researchers for Library and Archives Canada Document Disclosure Project for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Her research on historical and contemporary slavery, including human trafficking, helped inform Canada's Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. She earned her PhD in history at York University and has expertise as a professor at L'Université de Saint-Boniface and the University of Winnipeg. Since 2018, she has overseen a team of researchers and policy analysts within Manitoba's civil service, conducting work focused on the human rights and best interests of children, youth, young adults, and families. And Karlee is an important member of the Jewish Heritage Center's Holocaust Education Committee.
Thank you so much, Belle, for that kind introduction. It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce this evening's guest speaker, Jamie Michaels. Jamie Michaels is a writer from here in Winnipeg, where I understand he attended Grant Park High School. His most recent graphic novel, Christie Pitts, the focus of this evening's event, unpacks the tensions between immigrants and proto-fascists in 1930s Toronto that culminated in the anti-Semitic Christie Pits Riot, which, as we saw in the film clip, was the largest riot in Canadian history, involving approximately 10,000 people. This project has recently been adapted as a documentary in partnership with Historica Canada. It is also forthcoming as an animated film with support from Bell Media, Crave TV, and SGS Studios. Jamie is a Shirk Doctoral Fellow and Killam Laureate at the University of Calgary, where he researches the potential of historically informed comics to enact social change. He is also the creative director of the boutique press, Dirty Water Comics. Welcome, Jamie. I now invite you to share your screen and present about Christy Pitts.
Great, thank you so much for those kind words of welcome. I'm just going to open up a presentation here. I'm just confirming that you can see my slideshow. Terrific. So good evening. Thanks to everyone who made time to be here tonight. A special thank you to Belle for all her organizing, without which these important events wouldn't be possible. And also a warm thank you to Dr. Sapoznik-Evans for moderating this evening's program. I'd like to open with some troubling statistics. I'll follow these statistics with a personal story, and that will kind of be a gateway into my motivation for creating this comic and give a window into the history of the 1930s Canadian Jewish community. It won't come as a surprise to many in attendance here tonight that anti-Semitism is on the rise. However, I found the extent to which this hatred has taken root as nothing short of alarming. So over 100 white nationalists and alt-right groups are active in Canada at present. 15%, and that's 5 million Canadians, express views that could be construed as anti-Semitic. Half of Americans don't know 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Over 1/5 of Canadian millennials haven't heard or not sure if they have heard of the Holocaust. And this is really shocking in light of the fact that Canadian Jews comprise 1% of the population, yet remain the targets of 60% of police-reported hate crimes, the highest per capita of any minority group. When I was in the 8th or 9th grade, all the schools in Winnipeg would spend a day at the Goldeyes ballpark. And as you might expect, having these sweaty, testosterone-drenched teenagers packed shoulder to shoulder with minimal adult supervision went off without a hitch. I'm being somewhat tongue-in-cheek there. A rival school approached where we were sitting. They called us dirty Jews and told us to get out of the park. Fights broke out in the stands. And I fought a couple of the instigators, and I got my face punched in accordingly. But in the great tradition of Jewish storytelling, I'll tell you, honest to God, you should have seen the other guys. So over a decade later, I was telling this anecdote, this story of this fight at the Winnipeg Goldeyes at a pub. And someone said to me, echoes of Christie Pitts. And at the time I nodded because I didn't want to appear ignorant, but in truth, I'd never heard of Christie Pitts. Like most millennials, I pretended to know what I was talking about and then went to the washroom to look it up on Wikipedia. And there truly wasn't that much information to bring this history to light. And I was shocked because it seemed like a big event in the history of the country. At the time of this conversation, I was a Jewish Canadian. I had studied politics and history at university, and Christy Pitts was and remains one of the worst outbreaks of racial violence in Canadian history. So how has it been swept under the carpet? How has Canada failed so gratuitously to face its own history? And what lessons can we glean from facing this history today? For me, my take on these questions is these failures stem from an inability to face the reality of multiculturalism. This year, Canada celebrates 50 years of an official policy of multiculturalism. And it's a terrific idea. You know, nationalism in its ugliest form celebrates one national group at the expense of all national groups. And multiculturalism, an idea, champions the idea of multiple groups. It's the idea that there's no hierarchy of nation, all origins are celebrated. This is the inherent goodness of multiculturalism. Canada was the first country in the world to adopt an official policy of multiculturalism, but it remains a work in progress. And for me, it remains a work in progress because we haven't faced the realities of Canadian history. I open with these statistics in front of us because I'm so concerned about them. They really, truly, they bother me deeply and they keep me up at night because they represent lived experiences. They're not simply numbers. If we're going to actualize multicultural values, we need to teach real Canadian history, not whitewashed Anglo-Canadian history, not two founding nations in the fur trade Canadian history. We need to look at the history of Canada through the eyes of the minorities who Canada has relegated to being second-class citizens. Critically, we need to teach Jewish history, not only through the events of the Holocaust, which we absolutely must do, but also the particularities of Canadian anti-Semitism. What does anti-Semitism look like on Canadian soil? In the documentary, we saw this sign for no Jews allowed. And I think that this is shocking how many people have memories of the signage across the country. It's shocking how many Winnipeggers have memories or familial memories of saying, yes, that's when Victoria Beach was off limits to Jews. That's when we couldn't join the Winter Club. That's when, you know, we couldn't eat at the gates. And I think that there's a deep communal knowledge of these persecutions that has stayed to a degree within the Jewish community. So if we continue to fail to understand our past, how can we better our present? In conjunction with the Christie Pitts Project, I give lectures on Canadian anti-Semitism. And it's, to me, very shocking how few young people are aware of the existence, simply the existence of contemporary anti-Semitism. Just to kind of repeat that point here, because it is shocking. There are young people from coast to coast who don't know that Jews are the recipients of hate. This is despite Jews being the highest per capita targets of hate crime in the country. So how can we combat this crisis if we don't acknowledge it exists, we can't face its history, or in some cases, we're not even in the auspices of being able to recognize anti-Semitism is a reality. I see a lot of reflections in today's social media, talking heads, Twitter. I see a lot of dog whistling, a lot of anti-Semitism that is sitting just below the surface, but everyone, they know what it means. This is a newspaper article from Victoria Beach complaining about unwanted people. And it's pretty obvious who these unwanted people are. If you look in the third paragraph, they're people who have special foods and meat. So this is a very thinly veiled reference to the Jewish community not being welcome very close to home to us in Winnipeg. And I think that's a small part of facing the history is knowing the warning signs. And I think the dog whistle is an early warning sign of these deep-rooted anti-Semitic viewpoints. And they grow and they gain power as they're allowed to creep into the daylight. This is an excerpt from the Canadian Nationalist. This was a Canadian fascist publication here in Winnipeg. And, you know, when I first saw this, I was so shocked, not simply that it existed, but that I hadn't heard of it. So I began the Christie Pits project as a means to kind of capture not only the Christie Pits riots, but the general anti-Semitism of the day. What did it feel like being Jewish in Toronto in the 1930s? What were the social commonalities? What did it feel like as a lived experience? So I began the project with a few years of archival research, and I thought the best way to capture that feeling would be to read my way through the newspapers of the day. So that would give me a feel of what did Canada in 1933 think about Nazism, about fascism, what did we know, what then was an unknown, and the results today are shocking. They're shocking in retrospect, but in a way they're not. So after reading the newspapers, the results were conclusive. On the right side of the screen here is Pierre Van Passen. And to me, Van Passen is like a real unrecognized hero. He was a journalist for the Toronto Daily Star. This is like a really heavy-hitting newspaper of the day. This is a Toronto Daily Star that had Ernest Hemingway as a cub reporter. This is a Toronto Daily Star that was breaking reports of Nazi atrocities to the world in 1933. His reportage led the Star to be one of the first foreign newspapers ever to be banned by Nazi Germany. So to kind of give a feel of the time, you know, Jews in Toronto would have more information available to them about the horrors of Nazism than many German Jews at the time. This is how important journalism is to democracy. This is how important journalism is to changing the world that we live in, and also how risky journalism is. Van Passen was interned at Dachau and managed to escape. But he really, you know, being the first North American paper banned by the Nazi regime is a badge of honor, but it also, you know, to make a implied point explicit, it means that everyone knew what the swastika stood for. I've got two columns here. This is one of Van Passen's articles on the left as the Nazis start to shut down all the Jewish stores in Germany. And this is, you know, a paper that reported front page Nazi atrocities day after day after day. And the image on the right is actually from a beach in Toronto. This is an image from Canadian soil. So I was truly shocked by this because this is a symbol and we know what it stands for. We know what it means to Jews, and we knew then what it meant to Jews. And we see this, you know, it's so relevant to where we are now, where the swastika is, again, ubiquitous across the country. And I think it should be as alarming now as it was then. And it also speaks to how fascism is always global. It never stays in one country. And I think that we have to combat fascism on every front because of the reality of that system. So reading through these newspapers gave me an emotional window into both how socially acceptable anti-Semitic racism was, and also seeing how this symbol gaining traction must have felt the Jews of Toronto. And this is a community of largely new immigrants or first-generation immigrants, and they're seeing reports of their friends or their family members or, you know, direct close relatives being accosted and murdered in Germany under the same banner that's now appearing in the city they had fled to in search of a better life. So I kind of wanted to draw attention to the affect of what that history must have felt like. And I thought, now that I have the bones and I've read through the newspapers and I've gone to the archives and I've read the scrapbooks and I've heard the audio testimonies. I want to package this history in a way that feels relevant to today, but is also accessible to this audience that is really missing the history of Christie Pitts. For me, that format was a comic book, a graphic novel. And I think that if you look at the statistics of the publishing industry, it's the one section of print material that's growing. People are buying comic books, they're buying graphic novels, they're using them as educational resources in schools and universities. It felt that I needed to be on this cutting edge, and particularly there were comic-specific devices that would enable me to do more justice to this particular story. So this is Gen 1 Christie Pitts. I'm kind of publicly embarrassing myself here by showing a little bit of my original artwork. So as you can see, this is what they would call an untenable form of illustration here. You know, it's one step up from the stick figure, but this is where a comic really starts. So I had the bones, I'd worked on the script, I'd done the research, I built the characters, I had the training as a professional writer, I had a master's in fiction, but I wasn't much of an illustrator. So from there, I thought, okay, how can we bring this to life? I created a script, I made some character descriptions, and I put out an open call for submissions. And this is kind of a back window into the comics process. These are 3 examples of what Christie Pitts could have looked like. On the left, you see one that is actually, you know, it's hand drawn. It's very Jewish inspired in the art. There's some echoes of Chagall there. And you can really see that this is like a Jewish take on a Jewish story. In the center, we've got very contemporary kind of how the classic comics of the 90s and 2000s were framed. Conventional line art, conventional framing. And on the right, something that's a little more eclectic, a little more indie. It has a bit of a Winnipeg do-it-yourself feel. But my critique of these is they're all, to me, excellent, amazing pieces of art. They certainly beat my rudimentary stick figures. But what they didn't do for me was evoke the feeling of the day. So I wanted the art for Christie Pitts to be able to be familiar if you read it in a 1930s newspaper. So we kept pushing, we kept hunting for new artists, and we ended up pairing up with this Winnipeg illustrator, Doug Fedro, who really did justice to this project. You know, and Doug and I worked closely together, shoulder to shoulder for many years. And I think it was really invaluable to have a non-Jewish partner on this project to know what elements, you know, maybe needed to be explained a little bit further or might be too insular within the community. We were doing a scene and I said, I want to set a scene at a boxing gym where the coach wears a towel around his neck and it's reminiscent of a Jewish tallis and the corners are frayed, and it kind of shows a transition from the, you know, the traditional Orthodox community to attempting to integrate into the new secular world. So let's do the boxing towel as the tallis. It's a good motif. He goes, Jamie, I love it. I can't wait to illustrate it. Quick question. What's a tallis? So I think that, you know, it's always good to have a creative partner that's going to push your ideas and make sure they're explicit and that they're clear. And Doug certainly was that partner for me. Another thing that was important, and I think that's unique to comics, is the way you can create a universe visually without having to spend time in the text to bring it to life. So I'm going to come back to that idea in a second here. Another comic-specific device is the ability to control the pacing. So these are the first 3 pages from the graphic novel. And the first panel you see on the left is an open splash panel. There's no gutters. The second has 3 panels. The third has 5. And if you follow the action of the text, this is 2 brothers reading the Toronto Daily Star, getting a feel of the violence going on in Germany. I just want to draw attention to 2 devices that we're using here. One is that as you increase the number of panels, the action constricts. So what we're trying to do is kind of give you the same feeling of claustrophobia as a reader as someone experiencing those events might undergo. Another thing I'm trying to do in this page, if you'll notice in the second panel, the actual headlines and the actual stories are scratched out of the newspapers. And I think many of these headlines really took me by surprise. So what I would try and do is I would wait till the end of a chapter and I would present you with the archival material that they'd be looking at in the newspaper as a way of surprising the reader. So these are comic specific devices that for me made it feel like the right medium to tell the story. Coming back to the idea of incorporating our archival material. This is the old YMHA right by Christie Pitts in downtown Toronto. And of course, many Jews were prohibited from joining the YMCA, which is an unfortunate origin story of the YMHA. And this is a Jewish peddler. So by taking this archival material and putting it in the background, I'm kind of anchoring it to a history of Toronto. I'm giving you an accurate feeling of the world without writing you a long exposition of what it looked like. You can see it with your own eyes as you pass through the action. And these are some of the headlines that really surprised me. I just want to draw attention to the time period we're dealing with. These are all headlines from 1933, from the Toronto Daily Star. So I think, in retrospect, many people say we didn't know the extent of what the Nazi regime stood for. The swastika could mean many things. You had people in Toronto in 1933 saying, oh, it's a symbol of fraternity and brotherhood. You have people kind of spewing the same nonsense today. And to me, these newspaper excerpts are a reminder of what the swastika stood for in 1933 and what the swastika stands for today. And it's the clearest way to cut through the dog whistling that we see so much of in the media. It's, a Nazi is a Nazi, an atrocity is an atrocity. And the Toronto Daily Star was really facing that before anyone else was. And I think that seeing these headlines is quite powerful, especially integrating it into the comic form. History is, it's blurry. It's hard to crystallize and bring to life in a way that's affective and meaningful. And there's so little material on the Christie Pits riots. There's the newspapers, which are incredibly important. There's some audio testimony. I conducted some personal interviews, but there's actually only one photograph of the Christie Pits riot. And I thought this is kind of a nice thing for me to be able to do in this process, was to take this blurry historical photo of the riot and bring to life little details of history on top of it. So this was kind of a way to make history clearer, both literally and metaphorically in this project. I also wanted to do something in comics called braiding. So I'm making allusions or references to contemporary time periods without them being at the expense of the events of the past. So I could kind of nod to the present in a way that wouldn't affect the historical accuracy of the project. For example, following the Unite the Right March in Charlottesville, I was really, horrified by these images becoming mainstream in the American discourse again. And I thought, if you're going to march in the streets, if you're going to be part of this historical continuum of fascism, I'm going to make this nod and I'm going to draw you into the comic as such. So unless you're familiar with this image, you probably wouldn't catch the association, but it's a nod to the history of the past still affecting the history of the present. So I think that every story has the ideal medium. I think that, Catcher in the Rye will always be a novel. I think The Empire Strikes Back will always be a film. And for me, Christie Pitts in its most potent form will always be a comic. I think there's some very exciting things happening in comics today. But again, coming back to those statistics we looked at the start of this presentation, we have very few tools to create a more humane world. And I think one of those tools is through culture that creates empathy, that creates a sense of understanding, and that allows us to see history as it is to change the present into what it should be. So those are my remarks on Christie Pitts for now, and I'll turn it back over to you, Karlee, for questions here.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for that wonderful presentation. I just wanted to remind everyone to please share any questions you have in the Q&A function. And so I now have a few questions for Jamie, after which we'll open up to Q&A from the floor. So Jamie, you touched on this already quite a bit, but in addition to what you shared around the rise of current anti-Semitic incidents, the need to face our history, to teach real Canadian history, and in particular to just question why this isn't being taught. What motivated you to take on this project? and to focus on this historical event in particular?
I think that for me, people ask what the motivation was. If I had to pin it down to a essential, and I've got some of the questions just on the slides to kind of anchor the conversation here. If I had to pin it down, I was angry. I had personal experience of anti-Semitism. Almost all of my Jewish friends do. I had been in punch-ups over it, at this baseball game, but I've been in several physical altercations based on being a Jew in Canada. And when I explain that to people within the Jewish community, some of them are surprised, but some of them feel that it's business as usual. And I think that when I explain it to my friends outside the Jewish community, they think that's impossible. That doesn't happen in Canada. So I thought there was a real loggerheads between reality as I saw it and perception as it existed. And this was a small way of bridging that gap. It was a small way of writing angrily. It's hard to do archival research angrily, but I'm the expert now. And really taking this motivation and making it something positive, a historical touchstone, especially one that can be brought into schools and universities, because as I give these lectures, I just can't fathom how badly we need it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And my next question for you is, why a graphic novel? And in particular, I know you've mentioned already that you wanted to provide that window into how it felt and looked at the time, which I can attest that having had the opportunity to read Christie Pitts that you have successfully achieved. But in particular, I'm just curious to know, did you take inspiration from Mouse by Art Spiegelman, and in particular on that novel focused on his father's historical experience?
So if anyone in the audience hasn't had a chance to read a graphic novel, Mouse should be the first, Christie Pitts should be the second, right after. But Mouse should absolutely be the first. And I think that it's so powerful how Spiegelman tells the story of his father's experiences through the Holocaust. So I certainly agree that it's precedent setting. I just wanted to make a digression and discuss the medium itself. And I think people don't know this, but the history of comics is the history of Jewish immigration to North America. Comics are a particularly Jewish medium. If you look at New York in the golden age in the 30s and 40s, the comics industry is dominated by young Jews who were trying to get into conventional publishing. It was a de facto barred for Jews in North America, and they were stuck in the lowest common denominator of the publishing industry, which was comic books. So if you look at Superman, you've got a guy, he's a new immigrant to America himself. He's trying to blend in. He's trying to learn the customs of the country he's living in. He happens to have a Hebrew last name because he was written by, Jewish writers. If you look at, he wasn't always Stan Lee. At one point, he was Stanley Lieber. He wasn't always, Bob Kane. At one point, he was Bob Cohen. So these names change, but the stories are, to greater and lesser extents, Jewish stories. For me, the most influential comic creator is Will Eisner. And I kind of like him for two reasons. One, he's considered the grandfather of the graphic novel. But two, he never changed his name and he never changed his content. Will Eisner wrote Jewish graphic novels long before that was going to be cool. And he never made the flip to superheroes in the same pulp fashion. So I would say Will Eisner and Art Spiegelman are definitely two people I wanted to nod to in this conversation.
Excellent. And I can also attest that in the past, students of mine have really appreciated this medium. And I think for a lot of people, it's much more accessible for them as opposed to, let's say, a nonfiction book. So I have 3 more questions, and then we're going to open up the floor for general Q&A. And I want to thank everyone for the questions we've received already. Jamie, as you note, the characters are fictitious, but they are based on archival documents, newspaper accounts, primary source documents, audio testimonies, interviews, and photographs. You do a wonderful job of providing us with a window into how things felt and looked at the time, including Yiddish language, the physical spaces where events took place, the Depression, the growing rise of anti-Semitism, debate between peaceful protest and violence among Canadian Jews, and the interesting ways in which Jewish and Italian immigrants were brought together by virtue of xenophobia and intolerance. What was the most surprising or interesting finding during the course of your research?
That's a terrific question. I'm hesitant to give one instance, but one thing that shocked me in the course of the research was that I had to modify ideas in the book in some ways to be more nuanced and in some ways to be less nuanced as history unfolded around me as I was working on it. You know, I thought maybe some of the arguments could be subtler. And then watching this Unite the Right rally and the resurgence of North American anti-Semitism, I thought it had to be more overt. So it's an interesting question of how the past and the present intertwine. In terms of one takeaway that I found hopeful and that was meaningful to me is the mayor of Toronto saying, enough is enough. We're not showing the swastika in Toronto. And I think when we look at Canada now and, you know, our anti-hate speech policies, that seems perhaps unexceptional, but it's truly remarkable in the 1930s for that stand to be taken. So that was important for me to put at the forefront of the graphic novel.
Thank you. That segues really well into my next question. As you noted, following the riot, then Mayor of Toronto, William James Stewart, banned the swastika, which was one of Canada's first anti-hate speech policies. And as our event poster notes, based on your postscript, and I quote, "History never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. The events of August 16th, 1933 are depressingly relevant today. Then, as now, there exists great opportunity for small kindnesses," end quote. With this in mind, what has been the biggest takeaway or lesson learned for you in creating and publishing this important graphic novel?
I think that it's a huge demand for members of the Jewish community to always be representatives of the Jewish community, of Jewish history, be an emblematic Jew at all times and places. But when you have the strength for it, I think that it's important to do. And I think that it's important to make the time for conversations that don't always begin in an optimal way. You know, when I was 18, I had first moved out west. I was in a dorm in Alberta, and this guy came into the floor I was living on, Wranglers, cowboy hat. He looked the part, and he said, "I heard a Jew lives on this floor." And I'm like, well, first day, might as well just, get right into it. And I kind of thought we were going to fight, to be honest. That's what my life experiences had dictated. So I stood up and I said, "Yeah, I'm the Jew on this floor." And he goes, "I'm sorry if this is rude. I've made a list of questions. Would it be all right if we discussed them?" And he just had never met a Jew before. He was from rural Alberta. It was his first time living in the city, and we still keep in touch. It's not always going to be perfect. It's certainly going to be offensive inadvertently, but we navigate it as best we can. So I think that during this project, people made time for conversations with me where I wasn't the expert on the material. And I'm thankful that now I have the chance to do that for other people.
Thank you. I too feel that dialogue is so important, and that is how we can avoid othering, right? That can happen, and which is what often is at the heart of xenophobia. This leads me to my final question for you before we open up the floor here. What's next? I understand you have some exciting projects in the works, including a documentary and an animated film. Can you tell us a bit more about these projects?
Wait, Gavalt, I'm tiptoeing here a little bit because I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about and what I'm not allowed to talk about. But I've got one animated project that's had a press release, so I think this one's in the public sphere. I'm looking to adapt the Christie Pitts graphic novel into an animation. I'm working with a terrific studio in Toronto, and the gears are turning on that project, so that's very exciting. I'm in the early stages of scripting a project about Jewish contributions in the First World War. That's an animated film that I'm looking to produce or partially produce myself. So I'm in the early stages of writing grants and putting together funding, but the script is really coming together, and I've been able to work with some really amazing historians on that project. And at some point I will make time to work on this PhD I'm doing, but I just don't know when that's going to be.
Thank you so much. All right, well, it's now my pleasure to open up the floor here. I see one question in the chat, and then we will go into the Q&A box. So the first question we have here for you, Jamie, is from Miral Kapoor. And they ask, I know that Christie Pitts was a riot, but can you tell me a little more about what transpired?
Sure. So there was a baseball game in Christie Pitts Park between a Jewish team, a predominantly Jewish team called Harvard Playground, and a predominantly Gentile team called St. Peter's. At the game, a homemade swastika banner was unfurled, and both sides fought for control of that banner, the Jews to destroy it, and those who had perhaps sympathies towards the Nazi symbol to antagonize the Jews. And I think if you look at the areas of the city, it was a unique place for this to take place because it wasn't far from the Jewish strongholds and the Italian strongholds in terms of, neighborhoods of residents. And it was also close to really Gentile strongholds, that imaginary line of Harvard Street. So a riot broke out. It filled the street. We're looking at 6 hours of hand-to-hand combat, 10,000 participants. We're looking at, and because, this is a Canadian story, no one's allowed to die, but, people are very badly beaten, storefronts are broken into, and the police were woefully unprepared. There was, an obsession at the time with smashing unions and chasing down communists. And also there wasn't a lot of concern for minority communities being victimized, but there was a concern for large scale violence. So, this led to Draper, the chief of police, almost being sacked, and a bit of a public outcry, but I would call it spontaneous violence that was lit in the tinder of many, many years of second-class citizenship.
Thank you very much for the question and the great answer, Jamie. Our next question is from Antonio, and they ask, how can we explain the longevity and perseverance of anti-Semitism when there is so much information and evidence available?
At a basic level, and that's a very difficult question, and I'm not going to do it justice in this short a time frame, but we know what we're taught that's the extent of the knowledge that we have. And I think that anti-Semitism is a taught hatred. It's taught theologically, it's taught culturally. If you look at, the most continuously published text in the English language, it's the Canterbury Tales. You've got this story of Jewish ritual murder that's been a staple of the literary canon for hundreds of years. You've got, Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, where a Jew is going to cut out a heart for the sake of cutting out a heart. It's a Jewish thing. You guys get it. So I think that there's some horrifying tropes of history that we continue to celebrate. We're still reading the Canterbury Tales. We're still performing The Merchant of Venice. We're still, Oliver Twist is a classic here. And I think that this is a taught hatred, and it's also a systemic hatred because at a deeper level, we're somewhat of a mirror for the societies that host us in the diaspora. And I think that sometimes they don't always like what they see in their own reflections. So that's it's a brief answer to a question we could talk about for a long time.
Thank you. I really appreciated the quote that you shared in the video, I believe, by Irving Abella. We must do better. And so we all have a role to play when it comes to combating anti-Semitism. The next question is from Celine, and they ask, would you be able to put the book into the popular manga format? If I'm pronouncing that correctly, would it be appropriate to do so?
So that's an interesting question. I wrote the book as a comic in the Jewish tradition of comics, and that's where, for me, the book is going to stay. I don't have experience with the manga format. I'm relatively new to it. I don't have a firm grasp of the cultural connotations I'm working with. So for those reasons, out of respect for a form and a tradition that is not my own, Christy Pitts is going to remain a comic.
Thank you. The next question here is from Ray, and they ask, thanks for your very thoughtful and articulate presentation. My question is your book presently available at McNally or other Winnipeg bookstores? My family was living in Toronto in the 30s near Christie Pitts, so indeed I have known something about the riot since my 20s. Jamie, if folks are interested in purchasing your book, where can they do so? Where can they pick up a copy?
Yeah, the easiest way to grab a copy is our website. It's dirtywatercomics.com. We have an online store there, free shipping everywhere in Canada. We're really feeling fortunate. We're starting to become a course text for a few universities. So we've recently become an official corporation, which means I run the business less out of the back of my trunk and more out of standard shipping and distribution. If you prefer the brick and mortar experience, you can absolutely drop it at I Robinson and pick up a copy.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I'm going to go back to the chat here. We have a question from Vicky. They ask, how did Christy Pitts ball field get its name? Was it named after a person? Are there pits close by?
That's a terrific question. And it is a great name, isn't it? So it was at the time of the riots known across the city as Christie Pitts. The official name was Willowvale Park at the time, but it was known ubiquitously as Christie Pitts, and it used to be a gravel pit. And if you go to Christie Pitts today, you can still see the indentation of when they were using it to extract gravel.
Thanks for that question. And now from the Q&A box here, Greg asks, I was born and raised in Toronto. I and my family lived around Christie Pitts. I hung out at the pool at the Pitts every summer. I'm closely connected to the Italian community in Toronto and Winnipeg. Until this session, I have never heard of the Christie Pits riots. Why is this, do you suppose? Is it my own ignorance, or is it just the way our community deals with our difficult history?
Well, this is my grievance. I share this, this sense of confusion because I had the same one. How could I not have known the story? I was in the same point that you were at when I discovered this history. Again, I think that as a country, we fail to face the reality of our past. I think that this is often deliberate. And I think that, and this is understandable if you're leaving, and many Jewish immigrants left as persecuted minorities to North America. We're in search of a better life. It's frightening to say that we might not have found it here. It's frightening to say that these same persecutions may exist in Canada. We don't know the degree of them. So I think that we have to face the history. I think Bell used a line at the start of the session: in order to look to the future, you have to preserve the past. And I think we need to do that with Christy Pitts. I think we do that with Jewish Canadian history. So I don't have a conclusive answer to your question, but I can say we're working on it.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and also to Greg for that excellent question. Seeing no more questions in the chat, Belle, I'm going to turn things back over to you.
I would just thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this absolutely wonderful program to both of you. I do have one question that is close to what Greg asked. I mean, Canada is only beginning to reckon with its history, certainly vis-a-vis the Indigenous population, but it has not reckoned with its history of anti-Semitism. When we have students come into our center and do presentations, we always include this, and it's clear that it's the first time that they've heard about it. So my question is, in many countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, there's a distortion of history, as Yehuda Bauer puts it so well, in order to create a usable past for a nationalist agenda. Now, we don't have a nationalist agenda, I would say, today in Canada, but do you think that in a way, the fact that this has not been taught, I mean, I went to a Jewish school, I certainly didn't learn it, has something to do with creating a usable past, at least going back in time when, you know, the history of Canada was presented in a very different way than it is perhaps today?
I think that there are some tensions, some nationalist tensions in Canada that we don't want to look at directly. I think there's a deep permeating Anglo-supremacist Canadian nationalism that we've given a window dressing of multiculturalism to. And we haven't done it in a way that is honest or genuine. We've done it in a way that it's a pretense. That's not to say the idea of multiculturalism isn't important. It's incredibly important, but it has to be real. It can't be construction paper over an ugly object. It has to be an object that we redesign together. So I think that we're at this moment now where we can say, what is the historical record? And we can fight to put it forward. And I'm, you know, the graphic novel project has been a bit of a backdoor for me. Now there's an article in the Canadian Encyclopedia on Christy Pitts. Now there's a Historica Canada mini documentary about Christy Pitts. God willing, there'll be an animated film about Christy Pitts. And from there, we're leveraging. We're always leveraging. I don't sleep. I only leverage. So I'm, you know, talking to universities. Why aren't you including this? I'm lecturing as one-offs in classrooms saying, how have you not heard of this? How can we get this into the classroom? Ideally, this will become more of a communal responsibility, and it's lonely to fight the culture war alone, but I'm seeing more people do this. You know, this another Christie Pitts graphic novel came out this year, and I've smiled from one ear to the other because this is great. You know, other people are saying, oh, this is a good idea. I wish they hadn't maybe cookie cuttered it, but that's okay. The idea is sound. I like seeing it. The more we can bring this into the light, the more we can actualize multiculturalism. So there's a lot of work to be done. We need to be in the high schools, we need to be in the universities, and we need to keep pushing because the statistics don't lie.
I absolutely agree with you. And I mean, certainly we need to do more. This was something when we had the National Summit on Anti-Semitism, this was something that I brought up, that we really need not only to teach about the history of the Holocaust, but about the history of anti-Semitism in Canada. Also, I wanted to note that many of those newspapers, like the Canadian Nationalist and that you shared with us, are a part of our archive at the Jewish Heritage Center, and that is so important. And I don't think people realize just how extensive and important our archive is, and how useful it is to researchers, etc. And as we start to plan a total renovation of the Holocaust Education Center, we want to include things like that, because that's very much a part of our history, and certainly the history of fascism right here in Manitoba at that same time in the 1930s is something that most people are completely unaware of. So again, I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody who attended tonight. And I want to remind everyone that there are 2 more events taking place for this first Holocaust Education Week in Winnipeg. Tomorrow night, we will have local educator Kelly Hebert, who teaches at Westwood Collegiate, who is going to be talking about how he approaches Holocaust education with adolescents, and will be presenting the Mina Rosner Award to one of Kelly's students. And then the following day, we will be commemorating Kristallnacht. We'll be showing a film about how ground penetrating radar was used in Vilna to explore the remains of the synagogue, and how at the same time a Holocaust escape tunnel was discovered, one that was dug by Jewish prisoners. And we'll have geophysicist Paul Baumann, from Calgary who was part of that expedition team talking about his experiences. So if you haven't registered yet, please do, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow and the following night. And again, thank you everybody so much. If you know of anyone who may have missed the presentation tonight, please let them know that it will go up on our YouTube channel, probably as early as tomorrow. Thank you very much. Good night.